Edgar Allan Poe is certainly one of America's most famous and popular authors. Aside from writing poetry and literary criticism, he is credited as the pioneer of the modern detective story and the horror story. One of his most well known horror stories is The Telltale Heart. What's interesting about this story is it's told from the viewpoint of a murderer. And the question that comes to mind as readers is what's the purpose for this story? Why is the murderer telling us about the murder? Is he bragging about what he did? Is he so proud of what he did that he just cannot keep it to himself? He needs to let people know about it. So, one way to look at the story is that he's bragging or showing off. Another way to look at it is perhaps he feels some type of guilt or remorse about what he's done. Is this some type of confession? Does he seem to need to get something off his chest? Is he trying to confess to what he did and maybe seek some type of atonement or forgiveness, even, right? So is he bragging, showing off? Is he confessing? Right? Another thing to think about with our narrator is how reliable of a narrator is this, right? Do we find that this narrator is sane? Does he come across as a sane person, or does he come across as somebody who is insane? And right from the very first line, we get a sense of the narrator that he's trying to justify his actions. He says, "True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous, I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them." So the narrator is very conscious of the fact that the audience is making an accusation, right? He's being accused of being a madman, somebody who's insane. And so he seems right from the beginning to be trying to justify his actions and to prove that he is not insane. Okay, the word that he uses is mad. So he says, "How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story." So in this opening line, he kind of reveals his purpose. He seems to want to tell the story to convince us that he's not mad. Or maybe he's trying to convince himself that he's not. And so he says he tells a story. He says, "Let me ask you: would a madman, would a crazy person actually do what I did? Would a crazy person do this? Do I sound crazy to you? Do I sound insane?" So again, it's very interesting about the story is to get into the mind of the criminal here, get into the mind of the murderer and find out what's going on. What makes a person want to murder somebody else? Well, in the second paragraph, he says there was no real objective. He didn't have a good reason for wanting to commit murder. He says there was no objective, no object, there was no passion, wasn't upset by anything. He says, "I loved the old man." So now we get our first glimpse into the victim. All right, passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold, I had no desire. Right. So I had nothing about the old man that made me want to kill him. I didn't want to try to steal anything from him. I didn't hate him. I actually loved the guy, right? But then he says, "I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye. I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever." So what's so interesting about the story is he speaks as if he's a sane person. It's very rational, very calm, very developed, articulate writing. And yet, here's somebody who wants to kill an old person just because of some type of creepy eye that he has. That right away comes across to me as somebody who's not sane, right? So it's the kind of dichotomy there. It's like the way he's speaking in a very irrational way, but then he's behaving in a very irrational way. That's what's so interesting about the story. Now, because of Poe is sort of famous as the master of suspense. He knows how to write his sentences and words to build up suspense. And the suspense starts at the beginning and just intensifies as the story goes on. It gets more intense line by line until it culminates at the very end. Right. So that's another great thing about the story. So one thing I like about this is try to get into the mind of that murderer and figure out to what extent is this person rational and sane, or to what extent is he irrational and insane? And is he trying to brag or confess or do a little bit of both? And the other thing I really love about the story is that the way the suspense builds up at each moment and culminates in the climax at the end of the story. So now notice the calm, rational language used to basically retell a story about murder. So he says, "Oh, so gently, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, closed, so that no light shone out." And he starts to talk about like him practicing, going through the steps, just slowly, slowly trying to creep into the old man's room so as not to disturb him, and he's very methodical. He's basically moving very slowly, step by step. And he says, "Look how cunning. I'm so cunning the way I put the light in like that." And he said, "Would a madman have been so wise as this? Oh, so cautiously." So look at the repetition of slowly, gently, cautiously. And so he says, "I practice this way." And it goes on forever. And he says, "I did that for 7 long nights." So to me, just the very fact that he's spending this much time carefully going through each of these movements and these motions, to me, that's a sign that he's not mentally stable. That's a sign of insanity. So he's trying to prove to the reader, to me, I suppose, that he's not mad. But the more he explains the situation, the more I'm convinced that he is mad. So he says, "It was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye." So again, now the eye is evil. And then he says, and he spoke boldly. Look at the language, boldly and courageously. So again, that's where I get the sense of him trying to brag or to build up his own ego. He says, "Look at how prudent or cunning or careful or bold or courageous I am. Look at me." And he says, "A minute's hand," right? The watch, the minute hand of a watch moves more quickly than did mine. Okay. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than mine did. And he says, "I felt the extent of my own powers. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph." So this is where I got the idea that perhaps he's really proud of himself when he talks about his courage and his powers and his feeling of triumph, right? So he's getting sort of a thrill as he goes to murder this man. He has kind of a feeling of kind of power or triumph over this person. All right. So then after 7 long nights, we get to the eighth night, and he's going through. And the problem is that he kept going into the room, and the guy's eyes are open, and he just sees that eye, and he kind of loses his nerve. But luckily, this time he can see that everything is ready to go, and the conditions are perfect. And he says he hears a groan of mortal terror, the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul. And he says, "I knew what the old man felt and pitied him." So that's another glimpse into the psyche of this murderer that he says, I can identify with. I know what he's feeling with that sound of that mournful terror, right, from the bottom of the soul, right? But this time he says, "A single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and full upon the vulture's eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it." So what you notice is that the first 7 times he tried to go in to see the man, he was kind of sleeping. and he didn't go through with it. But this time the light falls on the evil eye, and the kind of rage overcomes him, and he goes forward with his plans to murder this old man. He says, "And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses?" So he says, I'm not crazy. I'm not insane. I'm not losing my mind. I just have really good senses, specifically, have really good hearing. So I started to hear a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. So it says, it was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. So he sees this eye, he hears the guy's heart beating, and it gets him kind of all worked up. And then he just goes in there, and you wonder now, is he actually hearing the person's heart? Does he really have just really good hearing, or is he losing his mind? So the heart, it says, grew quicker and quicker, louder and louder every instant. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. So now the heartbeat is supposed to be so loud, he's afraid that the neighbors are going to hear the thumping of the heart. All right, it's not normal. You don't hear somebody's heart beating next door. It's hard to even hear it. You can get very close to a person and not even hear it. All right. So ask yourself, does he just have really, really, really good hearing, really acute senses, or is he going insane? So it says the man shrieked once, only once, and he jumps on him, right? Uh, does he suffocate him, strangle him? When he basically kills the old man. And he says he was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. Now, again, he keeps repeating. So if you still think me mad, so he keeps reinforcing that he's speaking to us, the audience, and he's aware that we are judging him, that we are calling him crazy or calling him mad. And he's trying to defend himself and say, look, if you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. I love the fact that he says that. He says, if you still think I'm mad, but at this point, you probably don't think that anymore. But if you still do, wait till you hear what I did next. Then you'll be convinced that I'm sane. I thought that was a very interesting line, because what he does next sounds to me like something that somebody crazy would do, right? He says, I dismembered the corpse. He cut up the head and the arms and legs. He cut up the body in a bunch of parts. And then he pulled up the planks of the floor and put all the body parts down into the floor and then covered it over with the boards. And again, he says, I was so clever, so cunning. No human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. So he goes, so he finished, goes, so would a madman do that? And I'm thinking, yes, yeah, a madman would do that. So it's kind of ironic to me that he's trying to give evidence to prove that he's sane. And to me, all the details show that he's not sane. So now he said, now, even if he did have really good hearing, I might buy, okay, you can hear the guy's heart beating. But then he's already told us he's killed the person. And in case we're not sure if he's dead or not, he's already said he's cut off the head and all the body parts and put them in the floor. So I think we can be 100% certain that at this point that the old man is 100% dead, completely dead. Well, at this point, 3 officers show up, and they said that a neighbor had heard some type of shriek, and they were concerned, and so we're here to investigate. And he goes, oh, no, I just having a bad dream. The old guy's out of town. He's off in the country. He's not here. And then again, this is where I get the idea of him bragging. He's so confident in what he's done, is that he invites the men in. He tells them, look around, search everything you want, anywhere you want. And he says, I brought chairs into the room, And I decided to put the chairs right on top of the body of this old man. And he's sort of proud of himself. He says, "Look at my wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placing the seat on the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim." Now, this is told through the perspective and the memory of the murderer. So I'm not sure how accurate or reliable this narrator is. So I'm trying to imagine what's going on with the three officers. The narrator keeps telling us that the officers did not suspect anything, they didn't know what was going on, but I have a sense that maybe that's not the way it really was. I think the officers are probably very suspicious. He's probably acting strange, sweating, acting nervous. Uh, they heard that they got a report from the neighbor who heard a scream or shriek. And so they're probably pretty suspicious at this point, even though the narrator is bragging and saying that they don't know what's going on, right? Well, now I don't care how good his hearing is, but now he starts hearing the beating of the heart again. And I'm pretty sure that after you cut off the head and dismember the body and bury it, that the heart is not beating anymore. And he says, so the heart, the sound of the beating heart increased, and yet the officers heard it not. And it's just very, very interesting, kind of awesome ending as he starts to just really get so nervous and panicky, and the sound gets louder, louder, louder. Notice how Poe builds up that suspense. He didn't just say it got louder. He goes, it grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. And he's freaking out. He's like, "Is it how could they not hear that? It's like so loud. He can't believe it, right? Is it possible they heard it not? No, no, they heard. They suspected. They knew. They were making a mockery of my horror." So he thinks that they obviously all can hear the beating of the heart, but the officers are trying to pretend like they didn't hear it just to kind of screw with him and stuff. And so he says, "This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than the derision. I could bear these hypocritical smiles no longer." They're probably just sitting there thinking, what is this guy freaking out about? We're just here to ask a couple of questions. He said, "I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder." And then finally he just snaps. "Villains," I shrieked. "Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beginning. Sorry, it is the beating of his hideous heart." And so obviously he's found insane. He's probably, where is the narrator at the point that he's talking? He's probably in some type of asylum somewhere, been convicted of this murder or found to be insane. Okay. So anyway, just a classic horror story, suspense building up, building until you get the high point of the action happens at the very end when he freaks out and basically confesses. And so it's up to you to think about, is he trying to get something off his chest and confess? Is it from guilt that's eating him up inside? Is he just completely arrogant and bragging and feeling powerful because he destroyed another person's life? Is he rational and intelligent, sane, insane? That's what makes this story so fun. All right. So in this story, we have the perspective of the murder, the one committing the murder. Now, if we look at another story, a story called "A Good Man is Hard to Find" by Joyce Carol Oates, we see a story told basically from the point of view of the victim instead of the perpetrator or the murderer. Okay. So this story by Flannery O'Connor, "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And so I'd like to think about, and there's a picture of her. Now, funny, when I saw the picture of Edgar Allan Poe, I said, yep, that looks like the kind of person that writes horror stories. He looks kind of creepy. I think If I wanted to picture somebody who wrote the Telltale Heart, that's exactly what I would picture. But I always thought it was interesting that Flannery O'Connor is really an awesome writer, and she can write about this sort of like Southern Gothic literature with a lot of very dark side to it, a lot of violence. And then I look at the picture, and the picture to me doesn't match. She seems like a librarian or a nice woman who would not be writing about such dark matters and stuff like that. So I just thought those were clever. I mean, it's kind of funny just to compare the pictures of Poe and Oates, right? But what's interesting about this story, again, is think about those same elements, the suspense and the ending of the story. This story doesn't build up suspense in the same way. We're not inside of one person's mind and thinking about the thoughts as the person kind of retells the story. It's told from a third person perspective, but the emphasis is really much on the grandmother. And we see more description about her. We get into her mind, her thoughts. She's the one who speaks the most throughout the story. So let's kind of just consider, even though it's not a first person narrative like Poe's story was, but it really is from the perspective of grandmother, right? So what's interesting again about the story is that the story starts off as a very comic story. This is kind of like a goofy family. They don't. It's not a very close family. They don't communicate with each other. They don't seem to be listening to each other or even care about each other. And a very comical family. And then at some point in the story, it just turns, and it turns from a comic story into a kind of a horror story. It turns into from comedy to violence. And that's kind of an unexpected turn. Now, when I go back and read the story again a second time or more, I see a lot of very subtle clues leading or kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen at the end of the story. But I didn't really notice it at the time. So it's important when you read a story to pay attention to those details and kind of put them into your mind, and so that later on you'll start to recognize connections and put things together. Okay, so let's start off with the depiction of this family. Why do I think that the family is not very close? They're not very caring. They don't seem, there's a disconnect among the family members, a kind of an insensitivity, a lack of communication. All right, so I'm going to show you how I got that impression from the family. So the family's on a trip to Florida, and they're starting off. They live in Georgia, and they're traveling down south to Florida, right? And says the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind, right? So you get the sense that everybody kind of has something different that they want, and they're kind of fighting in like a self-centered way, like trying to get what they want from themselves rather than kind of doing what somebody else wants to do, right? There's not a lot of compromise and stuff. So as she's trying to convince them, hey, let's go to Tennessee, the son Bailey is described as being bent over the orange sports section of the journal. And so the fact of him like being bent over the sports section is, it's like he's trying to read this newspaper and he's not really listening to the grandmother. So then she says, look, she gives some of her reasoning why she does not want to go down to Florida. She says, this fellow that calls himself the misfit is loose from the federal penitentiary and headed toward Florida. So if some a very violent criminal, convicted murderer, has escaped from prison and is headed to Florida, it doesn't seem like a good thing to take your family to a trip to Florida, right? So she says, and here she comes across as the mother, or the mother-in-law, butting into the family saying, look, I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that, a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. So finally, Bailey, it says Bailey did not look up from his reading. So when it says he was bent over the page and did not look up, there's a mother and her son, and she's trying to plead with him and say, hey, you might be putting your family in danger, and he's not listening to her. So that's one of the clues that I picked up on here at the beginning, right? And then again, if you look a few lines later, it says the children's mother didn't seem to hear her. See, this idea that they're not listening or hearing each other. Now we get the names of the two sons. We realize that Bailey and his wife have two children. I'm sorry. John Wesley is the son, stocky child with glasses. And notice his attitude towards grandma. He comes across very rude to the grandmother. He says, if you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home? And then June Star, the sister, she jumps in and she says something rude too. Oh, she wouldn't want to stay at home to be queen for a day. And she said it without raising her head. See, when they keep talking about without raising their head, it's again showing that they're not really connecting or listening. Also, you wonder where a young girl like June Star got the expression, she wouldn't want to stay home to be queen for a day. It's almost that June Star has overheard her mother criticizing her grandma and has picked up that language. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but this is some real foreshadowing later because grandmother says, well, what would you do if this fellow, the misfit, caught you? The grandmother said. John Wesley says, I'd smack his face. Okay, well, as we know, at the end of the story, the boy is caught by the misfit. And we need to look. When we get there, let's look. Does John Wesley smack him in the face like he brags about here, or does he act differently? All right. All right. So now it's time. They're not going to listen. They're going to go to Florida. They're not listening to grandma. Again, she's going to come along anyway, just like June Star said. Maybe she doesn't want to miss the chance to be queen for the day. And notice that she's the first one in the car ready to go. You get the sense that she's probably going to get in the car first and then brag about the fact that she was ready and that other people took too long to get ready. And she kind of notices she kind of smuggles her own cat in there. She's got this big black valise, and then she says she's hiding a basket with Pitty Sing, the cat, in it. So she's like smuggling her cat in along with them because she doesn't want to leave the cat alone. Right? So that cat, Pitty Sing, plays an important role in the plot later on in the story. Right? Now, the way the grandkids treat the grandmother. I don't know if you've seen the movie Talladega Nights, but I kept thinking about that movie as I was reading the story, um, where the kids are just really rude and they just cuss and say rude things to the grandma. And I just thought of those kids in this story, right? So she's there in the back seat, grandma, with one of these kids on each side of her, and she's got this cat there at her feet. Now, Bailey is driving up there. The mom's up there with the baby in the front seat. So they're leaving Atlanta. And look at the details. They left Atlanta at 8:45 with the mileage on the car at 55,890. So why are these details given? Well, the grandma's writing stuff down and she just likes to know, like, okay, what time did we leave? How long did it take us to get there? How many miles did we travel? She thinks this will be interesting information that she could share with people later. Now, I'd like you to focus on how old-fashioned the grandmother is. She's like the old uh, generation with her white cotton gloves, and she's got a very formal hat on, and her clothes and her gloves. It's very formal, and it says, look, in contrast, the children's mother still had on slacks and still had her head tied up in a green kerchief. See, so there's the contrast of between generations. It says their grandmother had on a navy blue straw sailor hat with white violets on the brim. Her collars and cuffs were white organdy trimmed with lace, and her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of um, cloth violets containing a sachet. In case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. All right, so that's important to the theme of this story is that she feels that she is a lady. She's always talking about she's a proper woman, always thinking about proper manners and etiquette. Say yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, sir, no, ma'am. Say please and thank you. Follow all of your proper manners. So she comes across very old fashioned in that way. And she's always looking back to the past and thinking that the past was better than the present, that things used to be better when she was younger. She's constantly reminiscing and thinking about her past life. And she thinks that so much of the past life was better than things are now. So notice how she keeps butting in, right? She has to tell Bailey, oh, by the way, the speed limit's 55. Oh, there's patrolmen hide around here. They like to hide behind billboards and give out tickets, so be careful. She's constantly pointing out interesting details of the scenery. But notice it says the children were reading comic magazines and their mother had gone back to sleep. So again, nobody seems to be paying attention. They're just busy doing their stuff, reading their comics. Mom's up in the front seat sleeping. And so again, as they travel along, there's again a lack of connection here. And now here's where I thought about Talladega Nights and the rudeness of the children. The grandmother says, if I were a little boy, I wouldn't talk about my native state like that, right? Because John Wesley had just said, look, let's get through Georgia fast. You know, I don't want to look at Georgia. And she says, well, if I were a little boy, I wouldn't talk about my native state that way. Tennessee has the mountains and Georgia has the hills. and John Wesley says, Tennessee is just a hillbilly dumping ground, and Georgia is a lousy state too. You said it, June Star said. And so that kind of got me chuckling a little bit there. It's just a hillbilly dumping ground. And so she's trying to say you should show pride in your state and you should show respect. And he just says it's stupid. And she says, in my time, children were more respectful of their native states and their parents and everything else. People did right then. I really want you to focus on this passage right here in paragraph 19, or I guess 18. I want you to see the contrast here. She's talking about her day when people did right. And then she says something racist. She says, oh, look at that cute little pickaninny. And she's looking at a Negro child standing in the door of a shack. So you think about her life. She's talking about how great things used to be in the past, that back in her day when she was young, people did right. But yet racism was much, much worse back when she was younger, right? There was Jim Crow. There was probably the KKK. We had African Americans did not have, had to sit in the back of the bus. They had to use separate entrances, separate water fountains. You know, down here in the South during the grandmother's day, there was a lot of discrimination and a lot of racism and just straight out racial violence. You know, think about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and all the progress made and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But in Grandma's day, there was a lot, things were a lot worse. There's a lot more violence and racism. And so I think it's intentional. The way I was wondering why did the author write this passage like this, where she says, look, in my day, children were more respectful and people did right. And then she says, hey, look at that little Negro child. And it seems to be interesting to put those two right next to each other. And to me, the way I interpret it is that there's just an irony there that she's acting like everything was better in the past. Now, maybe it was true. Maybe more people were more polite and respectful in some ways, right? But there's a lot of things that have improved over time. We may have lost some things too, but it's difficult to look at the past and say that the past was better than the present because it may have been better in some ways, but a lot of progress can be made and we can't overlook that. So, okay, so I wanted to point that out, right? And so we get another hint of that sort of maybe racist past where she says, look at that graveyard. That was the old family burying ground that belonged to the plantation. So that reference to the plantation, that old South built on slavery. So that's part of that past, that legacy of Georgia and the South, and is and grandmother's trying to say we should be proud of our heritage and be proud of our state and be proud of this stuff, but not we should not be proud of everything about the past, right? So again, she keeps emphasizing manners and etiquette. You get a sense that people were probably very mannerly back in the 1800s. They're owning slaves. They may have had proper manners, and yet they're doing brutal and brutally violent acts against an entire group of people. So it's weird. It's very interesting that a society could be on the surface seem so polite and mannerly, but deep down underneath be very violent. So she says to the kids, they wanted to throw their trash out the window and litter, and she didn't want them to do that. And then they start fighting. Remember, they're sitting on each side of her and they start slapping each other over top the grandmother. So they're trying to throw stuff out the window. They're fighting, whatever. This just seems like such a crazy, crazy family trip. And if you've ever traveled across country or a long distance in a family car, you can understand how the tensions rise inside the car, and it smells bad in there, and people want to get out, and they start fighting. So she keeps reminiscing about the past. And then they stop off. It's kind of interesting interruption to the story. They stop off at this place called the Tower and run by Red Sammy Butts. And they have a barbecue restaurant and stuff. There's like some kind of monkey outside. And it says Red Sam's wife is a tall, burnt brown woman with hair and eyes lighter than her skin. And Red Sam says, "Oh, ain't she cute?" Leans over to talk about June Star. "Would you like to come to be my little girl?" I try to say something, and she goes, "No, I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't live in a broken down place like this for $1,000,000." And she ran back to the table. So you see how very direct and rude June Star is. He says she's so cute. Would you like to come live with me? And she says, "I wouldn't want to live in a dump like this." Right? But it's very interesting that that Sammy and grandmother have this conversation, and they say, "These days you don't know who to trust. Ain't that the truth?" So Red Sam says, "You don't know who to trust." And grandmother says, "People are certainly not nice like they used to be." And that's, again, I wanted you to think about that. And did people really used to be nice? I mean, were they really nicer in the past than they are at the present? So this is just grandmother's nostalgia, thinking about all the great things about the past. But we cannot just look at the past through rose-colored glasses. We cannot just try to see only the good in the past. We have to see the good and the bad. So she keeps acting like people used to be nicer than they are now. And then you should have a big question mark there. Is that really true? And the grandmother says, "Hey, did you read about that criminal, the misfit that's escaped?" Okay, so now this is the second time we've heard about the misfit. So if we haven't really started to think, hey, I wonder if the misfit has something to do with this story. Why do they keep bringing this up? Now, I have to confess, I don't think the first time I read the story, I thought too much about it. I should have had like bells and whistles going off. I should have known, Well, this family's got to be running straight into the misfit. We know they're going in the same direction. The misfit's been mentioned a couple of times. The grandmother has said we probably shouldn't go to Florida because the misfit is on the loose. And so the tension starts building. And if you start to really follow the clues, you think something's probably going to happen here. And then Red Sammy actually says what is the title of the story, which is "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And you should really think about what that means. What does it mean to be a good man? Do they mean a good man is moral, is heroic, sacrificial? Is a good man kind or compassionate? Does a good man have uh, good manners, good etiquette, saying please and thank you? What do we mean by a good man? A good man is hard to find. And I think we think of a good man could also mean somebody who is always willing to think about other people and not be kind of self centered. Red Sammy says, everything is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched. Not no more. And it says he and the grandmother discussed better times. So I thought about that. Well, people used to be able to leave their door unlocked and not have to worry about somebody attacking them. But like I said, they also had African American families would have crosses burned in their yard. They would be pulled out of their houses. They would be hanged on a tree, and they went through all other kinds of problems. So and there was not a lot of equality for women either. The options for working were very limited, and so there's so it seems interesting that they would reminisce about how everything was so nice you could leave your door unlocked. Well, maybe that was true, but again, think about the negatives. And to remind us of that, the past is not always better. Right here in paragraph 45, it says she woke up and recalled an old plantation. So they get on the road. Grandma starts to remember a plantation that she had visited once when she was a young lady. So again, that reference to plantation is a callback to a dark time in American history. Now she wants Bailey to go and she wants to make a side trip over to see this plantation and knows that Bailey likes to stay on schedule and keep going. And so she says, "Hey, can we go see that house?" And Bailey won't give in and do it. And she's like, "Look, it's not far from here. It only take us 20 minutes." And the kids are all begging. They all want to go see the house or some type of secret, secret passageway in there that they think is cool. And they all want to go in there and they're having a temper tantrum. Like it says John Wesley kicked the back of the front seat and June Starr hung over her mother's shoulder and whined desperately. They're having a temper tantrum. And they wanted to know, why don't they ever get to do what they wanted to do? Again, there's that kind of selfishness. I want to do what I want to do. Nobody seems to want to do what the other person wants to do. It's very self-centered. They're all in their own world. They're all disconnected and isolated from each other. So Grounder says it's not much farther. So they finally agree to go there, right? And I love this is the I thought was the most comical scene of the story is that he says, "Okay, I'll give in. Everybody's freaking out. Let's just go down this road and let's just see this plantation house and then let's get back on our trip." And as they're going, a thought says a thought that was so embarrassing that she turned red in the face and her eyes dilated and her feet jumped up. So some thought starts to cross through grandmother's mind. And she's so startled by it that she makes this sudden motion that freaks the cat out. The cat lunges and lands on Bailey's shoulders with his claws, which causes him to lose control of the car. The car rolls over once, and the mother and the baby are kind of thrown out of the car. They're thrown out. The door opens up. They get thrown out of the car. Everybody's kind of banged up. And then the grandmother, we find out what the grandmother, she realized that the house she was thinking of was not even in Georgia. It was actually in an entire different state. She realizes that they were heading in the wrong direction. So, like it says here in paragraph 65, as soon as the children saw they could move their arms and legs, they scrambled out of the car shouting, "We've had an accident!" They're all excited about the accident. They think it's the greatest thing. And it says the horrible thought that she had had before the accident was that the house she had remembered so vividly was not in Georgia, but in Tennessee. And Bailey has to get out there and says, remove the cat from his neck with both his hands and flung it out the window against the side of a pine tree. This is like a cartoon, right? And look at June Star is disappointed. Ah, nobody's killed. She's disappointed that nobody's dead. And then I love this line, passage, paragraph 69 says, the grandmother decided that she would not mention that the house was in Tennessee. Yeah, I think she should keep that to herself. All right. Well, at this point, some people pull up, and yes, it is. If you haven't figured it out by now, it is the misfit and his two sidekicks. And we get a sense that the misfit is much older than the other two. We get a good description of these three men. And the grandmother had a peculiar feeling that she said she seemed familiar to her, but she couldn't quite recall where she had seen this man before. So at this point, did you guys figure it out? Did you know this was the misfit or not? Right. Then they've got guns, and they said, "Look, I want you all to sit down there, and relax." And June's all rude again, like you can't tell me what to do. I love the very interesting description. It says behind them, the line of woods gaped like a dark open mouth. It's a very foreboding kind of atmosphere. They're out on some isolated country road out here with nobody around, and there's this dark forest behind by like an open mouth right there. Now look what grandmother does. She just blurts out, "Oh, you're the misfit. I recognized you at once." Now, would you say that to an escaped convict? Hey, I recognize you. I know who you are. And the misfit says, "Yes, ma'am. Yes, I mean, yes, ma'am." And he says, "But it would have been better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't have recognized me." So he just says, well, you've just screwed your whole family because you blurted out that you recognize me. It would have been better for all of you if you hadn't recognized me. And Bailey is so upset. It says he turned to his mother and basically cusses her out. Didn't even say what he said, but he just calls her something, just rips her apart. And the old lady's all embarrassed. And she says, well, you wouldn't shoot a lady, would you? And she removed a clean handkerchief from her cuff and began to slap at her eyes with it. Now she keeps calling him a good man. I know you're a good man. She says, I know you're, and look at her kind of elitism here. You're not a commoner. You come from a good family. You know, you can see that kind of classism and racism coming through the grandmother. She says, I think you're a good person. You're from fine, good family. And he's very sarcastic. Oh yeah, got the best mommy and daddy in the world. Right? And she says, you shouldn't call yourself the misfit. You're a good person. You shouldn't put yourself down like that. You should believe in yourself. And grandma keeps talking and talking. And what's so creepy is the family gets led away to be shot out in the forest. This is so creepy. And notice the polite way he says it. Remember, grandma keep talking about the importance of being polite and knowing your manners. And I said that politeness is like something on the surface. Is that we're not a very polite society anymore. We don't think about manners anymore and politeness. But maybe in some other ways things are better, right? So he says it very politely. Would you mind stepping back in them woods there with them? Excuse me, would you please do that? He didn't. It says like how polite he is. They're going to take them off. They take the mother and little June. I mean, sorry. They take little John Wesley over, and and Bailey, and they lead him off to get killed. And It says John Wesley caught hold of his father's hand and Bobby Lee followed, and they went off towards the woods. Now, John Wesley does not do what he said he was going to do when he was bragging earlier in the story. So she says, I know you're a good man. He says, no, I ain't, but I'm not the worst either. And he apologizes for not having a shirt to wear. And he says, we buried our clothes that we had on when we escaped, and we're making do until we get better. We borrowed these from some folks we met. Now, when it says when folks we met, I'm wondering, did they murder those people too to get those clothes, right? So she keeps bringing up religion. Do you ever pray? He says, no. And then they hear a pistol shot from the woods, followed by another. So now we know that the father and the son have been killed. He says, well, I was never a bad boy, but somewhere on the line, I must have done something wrong because I ended up in the penitentiary. Some head doctor, he said, told me that I had killed my daddy, but I think that that's a lie. My dad died in 1918 of the epidemic flu, and I never had a thing to do with it. So we're wondering, did he actually kill his father, or what was the crime that he committed, right? Now this is kind of creepy. They come back from the woods with Bailey's shirt, and they give the shirt to Misfit, and he puts it on. Then he says to the mother, lady, would you and that little girl like to step off yonder with Bobby Lee? And she actually says, the mother says, yes, thank you. What a strange thing to say. You're going to be let off. She's so afraid that she just can't come up with anything to say except for yes, thank you. And they lead June Star and the mother and the baby off and kill them. I don't want to hold hands with him, June Star said. He reminds me of a pig. So she's staying rude right up to the end. And now the grandmother is the last one left, and she's very, very distraught at this point. We hear a piercing scream from the woods, followed closely by a pistol report. She says, you've got good blood. I know you wouldn't shoot a lady. I know you come from nice people. No, she keeps talking about you come from good family. You're from a proper family. You have a lot of money. Race could be an issue here. You're a white, wealthy person. You come from good blood. You have good manners and stuff. You wouldn't shoot a lady. Like it's not proper etiquette or manners to shoot a lady. As a okay. Then it says there were two more pistol reports. So why are there three pistols? Well, one's probably the baby, and then one's the little girl, and then one's the mother. So now all five of these family members have been killed, and no one is left with the misfit except for grandmother. And he started talking about Jesus, and I think what he's referring to is the idea of forgiveness. That even though if there is that the misfit saying, look, it's either Jesus is real and what he said was true, which means there's some type of life after death, and that our actions are important and that they matter. But if Jesus is not real, or what he said is not true, and if he did not rise from the dead as Christianity maintains, he says, if there is no God in heaven, and when you're dead, you're dead. There's no afterlife. There's nothing beyond the grave. If this life is all that exists, then there's really no reason why you shouldn't just go do whatever you want to do, right? There's really no hope for life. Once you're dead, you're dead. So he says there's no pleasure in life except for meanness. The only thing you can do is just go around and murder and destroy stuff. That's the only pleasure that's left in life. Because then once you're dead, your life is over and you don't exist anymore. So that's kind of the essence, I think, of what that conversation with grandmother and the misfit are having about Jesus. They're talking about whether or not when you die, is there some type of afterlife? Is there a heaven? Do our actions matter? And if we do terrible things, is there a means of atonement or forgiveness or redemption? Is that available? Can people be forgiven and redeemed for the terrible things that they do in life? But if there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no afterlife, then it really doesn't matter what anybody does, and you might as well just go shoot everybody. I think that's kind of what the misfit is saying, right? Now, here comes a very interesting moment. It's the ultimate moment of the story where grandmother, for the first time in her life, and first time in anywhere in this story, does somebody show actual compassion, actual feeling and concern for another person. Instead of saying you're a good person, you wouldn't shoot a lady and all that stuff, she says, you're one of my babies. You're one of my children. And she reaches out and touches him on the shoulder. And the misfit is so surprised by that, he jumps back like he had just gotten bit by a snake. And as a reaction, just fires 3 times right into Grandma's chest and kills her. And so you get the sense that maybe that action of reaching out and touching him, that action of compassion or showing some type of emotion was probably the first time the misfit had maybe even experienced that. And so it's the last thing he expected. He was so surprised by it that he just jumped it back and shot her 3 times and killed her. And then the story ends with a very interesting line, paragraph 140, where it says, she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. And I kind of think about that poem where the grandmother, the young boy was 10-year-old boy was thinking he was all that and talking trash and being tough, and grandma just punched him upside the head to knock some sense into him. And I get the sense here that what's going on is that not until the last moment of her life, when she's staring death in the face, when this violent moment has stripped away everything in life, not until that moment did grandmother actually come through as a real sympathetic character, as a real human being who cared about somebody else. It took all of this violence to break down that outer shell and get to the real heart of the woman. When people think they're going to die, then, or in some circumstances, something good about them comes up. And it's kind of a shame that it takes such extreme situations to bring out the good of somebody. All right. And so Bobby Lee goes, wow, this is fun we're having. It's fun running around shooting people. And the misfit says, no, it's no real pleasure in life. You see, so the misfit really has got nothing in life that brings pleasure to him. There's no happiness or pleasure. Life is completely meaningless to him. And so that's why he's killing. So it's a different type of motivation into the mind of a murderer than we see in the Telltale Heart. This is not somebody who's insane or trying to brag or defend his actions. The misfit is somebody who has found no meaning or purpose or pleasure in life and has been reduced to just murdering. And when grandmother reached out and touched him, it was almost like a little voice that's saying, there could be something more to life. Perhaps there is some love and purpose or meaning in the world after all. All right. So it's very interesting to compare those two murder stories and to think about the way the suspense is built up and how satisfying the ending is. And then finally, I would like to point out that you should take a look at this essay from Mystery and Manners by Flannery O'Connor, in which she explains the reasoning behind the violence of her story. And she points out that a good story should have some element, some gesture in it that the whole story is built on. So that if you remove that one thing, there would be no story left. So if you took out that gesture where the grandmother reaches out and touches the misfit, if you took that out of the story, the entire story would be lost. And so that's the element. That gesture is the moment. That's the most important element of the story. So to understand what the story means, we have to think about the meaning of that gesture by the grandmother. And so what Flannery O'Connor says is that we're used to so much violence in our society today. We're so jaded and so desensitized that we don't really seem to care about other people. We're all living in our own worlds, kind of disconnected. And it takes a lot to shake people up and to get them to wake up. And so he says, our age does not have a very sharp eye for the intrusions of grace. And so I suppose that's the reason of so much violence in stories. She says, I have found that violence is strangely capable of returning my characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moment of grace. So this violence is a way of shaking people up, of waking them up and bringing them back into reality. And she says, this idea that reality is something to which we must be returned at considerable cost is one which is seldom understood by the casual reader, but it is one which is implicit in the Christian view of the world. So she says, in this story, you should be on the lookout for such things as the action of grace in the grandmother's soul and not for the dead bodies. Okay, so that's a contrast between two crime and justice stories, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe and A Good Man is Hard to Find by Joyce Carol Oates. Now we're going to look at A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, and we're going to contrast that with and compare it to a story called Yellow Woman by Leslie Marmon Silko.